HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Accident of Color, A Story of Race in Reconstruction by Daniel Brook. Read by David Sadzin. Preface. Down the Memory Hole. When Williston Henry Lofton, a history major at Howard University, decided to earn a master's degree in tandem with his bachelor's, he had all he needed except a thesis topic. Fishing around, Lofton became captivated by an odd subject: the history of the Civil Rights Movement. It was an unfashionable, even anachronistic choice. The civil rights struggle of 5 decades past was not something most anyone was interested in. Its victories had faded, and the landscape for African Americans was bleak. In official Washington, just beyond the gates of the Howard campus, hostile forces held sway in the White House, in Congress, and on the Supreme Court. Voter suppression was rampant, and police shootings of African American youth commonplace. But as young Williston dove into the archives, he discovered remarkable material. He went on to write a fine survey of the protests, boycotts, sit-ins, test cases, and legislation of the Civil Rights era. Lofton submitted his thesis in the spring of 1930 and entitled it Civil Rights of the Negro in the United States, 1865 to 1883. The monograph opened with these words: "A study of the civil rights of the Negroes in the United States in the 2 decades following the Civil War reveals surprising information to the investigator. The surprise exists not so much in the denial of civil rights to the Negro, for that is expected, but rather in the great degree to which civil rights were accorded the Negro by both the state and the federal governments." In unearthing the achievements of this forgotten civil rights movement, Lofton faced twin challenges. First, he was at odds with the view of leading historians who saw the granting of civil rights to African Americans during Reconstruction as a tragic mistake, and Klan terrorism as a necessary evil in revoking those rights. Pioneered by white supremacist historians besotted with the latest racial pseudoscience, men like William A. Dunning of Columbia University, this view had been popularized through Thomas Dixon Jr.'s Pulp Fiction and D.W. Griffith's subsequent blockbuster screen adaptation of it, The Birth of a Nation. Williston Henry Lofton was also up against rampant historical document destruction. White reactionaries had covered up the most stunning achievements of the post-war integrationists. Even if the undergraduate Lofton had had the time, the funds, and the freedom to scour Southern archives for original documentation, many were held by whites-only institutions that barred researchers of color, he would have hit numerous walls. In New Orleans, the school board records for the district's integrated period from 1870 to 1877 had long ago been expunged from the archives. At the University of South Carolina, the records of the Student Debating Society from the school's integrated era, from 1873 to 1877, had been defaced page by page with black ink tombstone pictographs inscribed Negro Regime. To try to fill these gaps in the primary source records, Lofton was forced to reconstruct America's first attempt at interracial democracy as best he could through newspaper coverage of civil rights activism and court records of civil rights cases. Facing these obstacles, even when W.E.B. Du Bois tried his hand at a history of Reconstruction, which he published in 1935, the nation's preeminent African-American scholar lamented that the material today is unfortunately difficult to find. Little effort has been made to preserve the records of Negro effort and speeches and actions. The loss today is irreparable, and this present study limps and gropes in darkness. In the depths of segregation, even with complete information, it would have been hard to properly process the anti-racist activism of the Reconstruction era. Under the system known as Jim Crow, named for minstrel show's blackface stereotype of a slave, Americans were pressed into legal categories of white and colored, with rights and restrictions allocated accordingly. Jim Crow's widening of whiteness, the one-drop rule of blackness, and retroactive complete conflation of blackness with servitude made it difficult to comprehend the leading Reconstruction activists on their own terms. These were men and women who defied binary racial categorizations and indeed fought against them. That such a disproportionate number of pioneering Reconstruction-era civil rights activists sprang from the distinctive, long-free, openly biracial communities of New Orleans and Charleston is no coincidence. For generations, New Orleans' Creoles of color and Charleston's Browns had been resisting the imposition of race-based rights and challenging America's black or white notion of race itself. Only in light of these communities' unique histories and self-conceptions can their cities' outsized civil rights achievements be understood. Just as an historian of medieval France must keep in the front of her mind that in the Middle Ages there was no France, only a smattering of feudal lands that would one day become France, so a student of Reconstruction must be cognizant that the firm racial binary Americans accept to this day is a result of Jim Crow, not a cause of it. The one-drop rule, the concept that any trace of African ancestry at all makes an American a Negro, was not even conjured until the 1850s and was not widely accepted until the early 20th century. It is only because mixed-race activists were defeated in their valiant effort to stop a regime of race-based rights that contemporary Americans view society through the racial blinders that we do. Today, decades after the dismantling of Jim Crow, Americans still see our society and ourselves in binary terms of white and colored. That our racial system is second nature to us, but incomprehensible to the rest of the world, even to people from other New World societies that once practiced slavery but never instituted Jim Crow, should highlight for us how peculiar it is. Most Americans still live their lives trapped in these outdated and scientifically unjustifiable notions. On the right, white nationalists patrol the ever hazier borders of whiteness, while some on the left see any questioning of Jim Crow's racial categories as an attempt to shirk responsibility for historical wrongs. This book does not wish to be such an attempt, nor does it wish to gloss over the flaws of its flawed heroes. Scores of the activists profiled, who fought for civil rights after the Civil War, had been silent on the evils of slavery before it. Some even held slaves themselves. But telling their stories on their own terms can help remove our own blind spots about the long, imperfect struggle to build the world's most diverse democracy, and about the racial system that still mars our national life. In our ever more multi-hued society, we may finally be able to hear these voices from the past, recovered from yellowed newspaper clippings and dusty court records, and heed their plea that there can never be full emancipation from American racism until we put the American system of race itself on trial. Introduction. Les Ambassadeurs. On March 12, 1864, a pair of Southern gentlemen, E. Arnold Berthenot and Jean-Baptiste Roudinet, arrived at the White House to lobby President Abraham Lincoln. They hailed from New Orleans, a city that had been retaken by the Union just 1 year into the Civil War and had become a testing ground for what the multiracial nation might look like when the war was won. The visitors were leaders of the city's distinctive openly mixed-race Afro-French community, and they presented the president with a petition signed by 1,000 of their fellow property-owning free men of color, demanding the right to vote. At the time, this was an audacious ask. Though the petitioners addressed the president as citizens of the United States, technically this was no longer true. 7 years before their visit to the White House, the nation's highest court had revoked their citizenship. In the Dred Scott case, a dispute ostensibly over slaves' rights, the Supreme Court of the United States had declared that an African American, whether enslaved or free, had no rights which the white man was bound to respect and is not a citizen within the meaning of the Constitution of the United States. This sweeping ruling was a vicious attack on free people of color nationwide. But the ongoing war was opening up new possibilities. The Union Army now brimmed with African American soldiers, and on New Year's Day, 1863, Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Yet when Lincoln had recently announced a plan for Reconstruction in Louisiana, it barred African Americans from voting. According to the Supreme Court, the petitioners had no rights that Lincoln was bound to respect, but they were hardly his inferiors. Lincoln had been born in a log cabin in Kentucky, and though whip-smart, he had completed just a single year of formal schooling. By contrast, Roudinet was a trained engineer. Before the war, he had worked as a food scientist on a sugar plantation, pioneering methods to turn raw cane into saleable commodities like molasses. And even with those accomplishments, he was the underachiever in his family. His brother, Louis Charles, was a medical doctor with degrees from Dartmouth and the Sorbonne. Burtneau, for his part, made his living as a wine merchant, that most refined of professions. In aristocratic fashion, this son of a French father and an Afro-Cuban mother went by his middle name. Lincoln was so low-born that he didn't even have one. While the wine merchant kept tabs on the Paris auction house prices of the latest Loire Valley vintages, the rail splitter turned commander-in-chief's entire international experience amounted to visiting the Ontario side of Niagara Falls once. In fact, it was Lincoln's youthful trips down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, especially his month-long sojourn there in 1831, that constituted the deepest cosmopolitan immersion of his life. For Lincoln, the meeting with Burtneau and Roudinet may well have felt like a visit from foreign dignitaries, if not interplanetary ambassadors. But the strangest thing of all about these visitors was their racial identity. Though these men were light enough to pass for white, Roudinet was just 1/8 African, Burtneau, with his rakish wave of dark hair, looked like a stereotypical Frenchman. They clearly had no interest in doing so. Burtneau and Roudinet were of partial African descent, and they were completely unabashed about it, willing to go to the White House as community representatives of African Americans in their state. They didn't feel that their African heritage made them any less American than their French heritage did. Lincoln, by contrast, with his dark features and anomalous height, had spent his entire political career dodging scurrilous rumors that he secretly had African ancestors. There are no transcripts of the meeting in the White House that spring day. One presidential aide later quoted Lincoln as saying, "I regret, gentlemen, that you are not able to secure all your rights, and that circumstances will not permit the government to confer them upon you." Still, the visitors clearly impressed the president. The day after their visit, Lincoln wrote a private letter to the governor of Louisiana, Michael Hahn, urging him to bestow the right to vote on some of the colored people, as, for instance, the very intelligent, and especially those who have fought gallantly in our ranks. Hahn ignored the president's request, and only when the war ended in 1865 did Lincoln finally go public with his controversial position on limited African American suffrage. Standing at a second-floor window with a crowd gathered on the White House lawn 2 days after General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox, the president discussed the terms of Louisiana's readmission to the Union. He urged that the ballot be conferred on the very intelligent African American men and on those who serve our cause as soldiers. His phrasing was nearly identical to what he'd written to Governor Hahn a year earlier, after being lobbied by Burtneau and Roudinet. For at least one person in the crowd, even this was a step too far. "That means nigger citizenship," a Maryland-born actor named John Wilkes Booth reportedly remarked to a friend. "Now, by God, I'll put him through," he vowed. "That will be the last speech he ever makes." 2 days later, the actor shot the president dead at Ford's Theater and leapt to the stage, ranting in Latin about tyranny. The Civil War was over, but its meaning was in dispute. The fight for equal rights was just beginning, and in its way stood an ambivalent voting public, a Supreme Court packed with elderly racists, and some unknown number of potential white supremacist terrorists, like John Wilkes Booth. Across the rural South, plantation owners schemed to resurrect something akin to slavery by assigning Americans different rights based on race. They hoped to rally those deemed white, whether rich or poor, immigrant or native-born, northerner or southerner, to their side, and to conflate African heritage with ignorance and barbarism. If equal rights were to be won, it would be with heavy reliance on people like Bertineau and Roudinet, who gave the lie to these bigoted and fallacious racial concepts. Concentrated in the cosmopolitan southern port cities of New Orleans and Charleston, their mixed-race, free-born community had the education, wealth, and connections to press for equal citizenship in the corridors of power. Now they were uniquely threatened by a Dred Scott-style race-based inequality that would make no distinction between freemen and freedmen, between wine merchants and cotton pickers. But they also had a mass constituency on the streets, the millions of new free people of color Emancipation had created. 1. Misfit Metropolises. In colonial times, Charleston, South Carolina, the peninsula at the confluence of the Ashley and Cooper Rivers and the Atlantic Ocean, was the South's leading seaport. Goods from all over the world flowed in, but the most important inflow was people: slaves and slave drivers, indentured servants and skilled free laborers, refugees and get-rich-quick schemers. Together, these newcomers groped over the decades to forge a new society in the New World. Before American independence, Charleston was more closely linked to the Caribbean than were other Anglo-American outposts. Fully 6 of the governors of the Charleston-headquartered Carolina colony between 1670 and 1730 were immigrants from Barbados, not England, and many of the planters were West Indian transplants as well. On the islands, these future Carolinians had imbibed more flexible, Latin-inflected notions of race than were common in the rest of colonial America. The Latin American racial system was still a racist one. The lighter one was, the better. Green eyes trumped brown eyes, and life was easier with tan skin than brown skin. But its foundational assumption was that in the New World there was precious little racial purity. With people from all continents living jumbled together for generations, virtually everyone was mixed, and the only question was what the proportions of one's particular mixture were. While the New World Spanish term la raza looks like a cognate of the New World English word race, it's more like its antonym. La raza denotes the human being the New World created, a mixture of all the world's ethnic groups, while race is based on the supposition that despite living together in the New World for centuries, each group somehow remains distinct. Race mixing is, of course, a one-way street. Each generation spent in the New World was more mixed than the last. Slavery, with its rampant sexual exploitation, made race mixing more common, not less. This was true everywhere in the New World, but Anglo-American colonists, steeped in Puritan traditions that frowned on sex in general and promiscuity in particular, became skilled in the art of not seeing what was right in front of their eyes. In Charleston, meanwhile, with its Caribbean-tinged outlook, mixing was more openly acknowledged than elsewhere. When a 1736 editorial in the South Carolina Gazette pleaded that mixed-race relationships at least not be flaunted, certain white young men, it proposed, should frequent less with their black lovers the open lots of the city. It took just a week for the paper to publish a poet's retort. "Kiss black or white," he urged. "Why need it trouble you?" At the time, the poet had the upper hand. Loath to give their wives any power to thwart their affairs, The rice plantation aristocrats who ran South Carolina simply did not permit divorce. And loath to hem in their sexual privileges, or, more worrisome still, prompt the precise adjudication of their own racial makeups, they never outlawed interracial marriage either. In every slave society, solving the social riddle of what to do with the oft-freed, mixed-race children of masters and slaves and their descendants presented a conundrum. In the Caribbean, the masters opted to enlist the ever-growing mixed-race free population as a middle-class buffer between themselves and their slaves. Colonial Charleston initially embraced this strategy as well, but in most of America, the demographic math was different than it was in Barbados or South Carolina, with their slave majorities. In the American colonies as a whole, poor, slaveless European immigrants and their descendants were the single largest social group. Political stability hinged on these impoverished Americans not overturning a system that left them poor. They would be won over to identification with the master class through race. The American Revolution supplanted an empire built upon the eternal inequality of monarchs and subjects, nobles and commoners, and masters and slaves, with a republic based on the self-evident truth that all men are created equal. Against this new egalitarian backdrop, the peculiar institution of slavery became a glaring contradiction. In the years after the Revolution, slavery, which had initially been justified on grounds of religion, imported Africans weren't Christian, and nationality, imported Africans weren't English, increasingly came to be justified through a new theory of supposed African racial inferiority. European immigrants and their descendants, though they came from tribes that had fought each other back home for centuries, would become, in America, a single unified people through the alchemy of race. And they would set themselves above and against a second category of American, those from the warring tribes of sub-Saharan Africa who would be similarly reconstituted into a single racial group. This bifurcation became more convincing in the new republic as white indentured servitude died out, even as the first federal census in 1790 still enumerated what it called free white people, free and white not yet being completely synonymous in the American mind. The cost of immigrating from Europe was declining, so there was less need for immigrants to sell themselves into terms of unfreedom to finance the trip. With each passing year, whiteness was more fully conflated with freedom and blackness with servitude. In time, white men were universally deputized as slave patrollers throughout the South, packing sidearms and demanding passes from African Americans they found off the plantation. In Charleston, as in the Caribbean, free mixed-race people were never fully boxed out of this role. Eventually, whiteness, a category that grew to encompass ever more disparate ethnic groups from Europe, West Asia, and North Africa, would harden into a kind of inherited aristocratic status in America. Ill-matched to American realities, where racial lines grew blurrier with each generation, in Charleston, the black-white binary was particularly anathema. But after the nation was founded, the Caribbean-inflected distinctiveness of early Carolina waned. In 1790, not 15 years into American independence, St. Philip's Episcopal Church, the oldest and most prestigious congregation in Charleston, where the white elite and their free mixed-race relatives had worshipped for generations under the same roof, announced that it was prohibiting its mixed-race members from being buried in the church graveyard. Mixed-race people might be free, but they wouldn't be equal. In response to their church's decree that they were good enough to worship, even marry in the church, but not good enough to be buried there, the mixed-race relatives of Charleston's leading white families organized themselves into a separate sub-congregation, the Brown Fellowship Society. Formed by 5 biracial freemen who dubbed themselves the Originators, the preamble to the group's rules and regulations declared, "We, free brown men, natives of the city of Charleston in the state of South Carolina, holding it an essential duty of mankind to contribute all we can towards relieving the wants and miseries and promoting the welfare and happiness of one another, and observing the method of many other well-disposed persons of this state, by entering into particular societies for this purpose, have freely and cheerfully entered into a society in Charleston and state aforesaid, commencing the 1st of November, 1790. By October 1794, the Brown Fellowship Society had raised enough money to purchase a plot of land to use as a burial ground, solving the immediate crisis that had sparked its founding. And it threw open the new cemetery to the entire free mixed-race community of Charleston. Taking on a broad communal responsibility, over time the society sponsored a school, founded a credit union, and organized a life insurance fund. For all the institutions it created, it soon spun off a literary society and a debating club as well. The Brown Fellowship Society's greatest creation was the community itself. The society made brownness a communal identity, elevating it into a racial category, at least within the city limits of Charleston. By doing so, the originators hoped to carve out a space for their community in the social and political minefield that was being free and mixed race in an America with a looming Manichaean racial order. As that order grew sharper every year, Charleston's Browns, as they were known, confronted the choice every middle class eventually faces: cozy up to the elite or make common cause with the masses. In the antebellum era, the Browns sought the former path before, pivotally, breaking ranks during Reconstruction. In part, family ties led the Browns in their initial identification with the elite. After all, they were the blood relatives of the city's wealthiest whites. But more crucially, they were living in a society where the distinction between slave and free mattered far more than gradations of skin color. Counterintuitively, Charleston's Browns were indifferent to the evils of slavery precisely because they lived in a city where those evils were so openly on display. Antebellum Charleston was littered with slave auction houses, the backs of which were jails where the human merchandise was imprisoned prior to sale. After a brief stay packed in the pen, slave traders paid the jailer auctioneers on a per-head, per-day basis, so churn meant money. Families were sold on the block. Nearly all were bound for plantations in the hinterlands, but different family members were often sold to different buyers, never to see one another again. If free brown Charlestonians entered these grotesque human auction houses at all, it was as purchasers, not as the purchased. For Charleston's free people of color, the barbarism in the slave pens only underscored how utterly different they were from the enslaved, no matter how closely their complexions sometimes matched. No doubt there was a social gulf between even the wealthiest Browns and their white relatives, but it paled in comparison to the social distance between their freeborn selves and the enslaved strangers coursing through their city in chains. Charleston's Brown community gained its only American analog by happenstance. When President Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory and its capital, New Orleans, from France in 1803. By the time of its annexation, the city of New Orleans, built on a natural levee at a crescent-shaped bend in the Mississippi just upriver from the Gulf of Mexico, had existed for 85 years. Having spent nearly a century as a possession of, alternately, France and Spain, the crescent city's social fabric reflected its Latin lineage. While the British typically tried to enforce a strict color line in their colonies, building their colonial outposts with a white town separate from a black town, the French were less punctilious. The Spanish, who usually sent single men as their colonizers, eagerly mixed with whomever they found in the lands they conquered. In colonial New Orleans, under French and Spanish rule, a system of recognized, institutionalized race mixing had been established. Though pre-American New Orleans never became as fully mestizo, as Spanish.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?